Hi, friends! Welcome, everybody, to Black History Quest, Oregon Black Pioneers History, Research, and Conversation Program. My name is, of course, Mariah Rocker, and I am your host for this evening. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to pioneer out with us. Now, we are coming to you live on the Oregon Black Pioneers Facebook and YouTube pages. If you can't stick around for the whole show, don't worry. You'll be able to find this and every episode of Black History Quest on our YouTube page, the Oregon Black Pioneers YouTube page. Now, if somehow you're unfamiliar with our organization, let me tell you just a little bit about it. We are Oregon's only nonprofit dedicated to preserving and promoting the experiences of people of African descent statewide. So we like to partner with other statewide organizations to help tell these, or other organizations throughout the state to help tell these stories. And we've been doing so since 1993, illuminating the seldom told history through a variety of ways, including books that you can purchase on our website, lesson plans that you can download for free on our webpage for K through 12, exhibits that we have on display throughout the state, and programs like this one. This is, in fact, our 9th episode of Black History Quest. Now, Black History Quest is Oregon Black Pioneers' original historical research and conversation program, where we get the opportunity to dive in and dig a little deeper into Oregon's Black history and uncover new research, and also get a peek behind the curtain to see what it looks like to do that sort of historical research. So every other month, we hire a local researcher to do this work and kind of pull on the threads of the history that we don't really know as much about. And so through this program, we're able to learn more about Oregon's Black history, to pay local researchers to do that research for us, and to also kind of take a look behind the curtains, behind the scenes. So this is a live program, so please make sure to leave your questions in the chat section of the live stream so we can discuss them on air after the presentation. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Tonight, we are very lucky to have Taylor Stewart as our history investigator. Taylor Stewart is the founder and executive director of the Oregon Remembrance Project, ORP. He's a lifelong Portlander and a graduate of University of Portland in 2018 with a degree in communications and a master's in social work from Portland State University from 2021. Stewart started the Oregon Remembrance Project in 2018 to help communities unearth stories of injustice and engage in the necessary truth-telling and repair required to reconcile instances of historical harm. His work connects historical racism to its present-day legacies in order to inspire contemporary racial justice action. In what started as a simple way to memorialize a man named Alonzo Tucker, the most widely documented African-American victim of lynching here in Oregon, Stewart has grown to see the power of reconciliation to rectify further instances of historical injustice. He gave a TED Talk with TEDx Portland in 2022 titled, "How Do You Reconcile a Lynching?", which applies the 3 R's of reconciliation, remembrance, repair, and redemption to the lynching of Alonzo Tucker. His work now extends to cover other stories of historical injustice all across Oregon. And we at Oregon Black Pioneers are very honored to partner with Taylor and the Oregon Remembrance Project in a variety of ways. Now, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Taylor Stewart. Hey, Taylor.
Hi, Mariah. Hi, everyone online. It's my pleasure to be here with you all and to nerd out on very niche topics of Black history in Oregon.
Perfect. Then yeah, we were in the right spot, and anybody who's here watching is too. Thank you so much for being tonight's history investigator, Taylor. We are honestly just so thrilled to have you join us for Black History Quest. So before we get started, we do start all of these presentations with a question. And Black History Quest really begins with a source that sparked an interest. So can you tell us start by telling us what source you were looking into and why it caught your attention?
Yeah, so I looked into the Green Book. For those of you who don't know, the Green Book was a tool for African Americans to navigate traveling across the United States. It would list businesses that were accommodating to African Americans. And so I looked through about 18 copies of the Green Book. My first intention and my interest in looking at the Green Book stems from my work around sundown towns with the Oregon Remembrance Project. We have a project called the Sunrise Project, with the idea that sunrise is the opposite to sundown and signals the start of a new day. So in many of these former sundown towns, we're trying to develop these new identities as that of sunrise communities, the opposite to a sundown town, a place where everyone can feel safe, respected, and like they can call that space their home. And so I was really interested in the Green Book because the Green Book is parallel to this history of sundown towns. It was a navigation tool for African Americans to navigate the prevalence of sundown towns across the United States. And I had expected to open up the Green Book, find Oregon, and then see the safe havens for African Americans across the state. And unfortunately, that was not the case. It was basically just Portland who was listed in the Green Book. And so I had to rethink about how I was going to use that information to contextualize a story. What would I be researching? When you look
Sure.
at the Green Book online, you sort of you go to the index to see what page number Oregon is listed on, and that page number doesn't often match up with the online page number. And so often I would flip to say page 76, and I'd end up in Ohio. I'd scroll through Ohio, scroll through Oklahoma, and I'd get to Oregon. And it really stuck out to me how much longer the Green Book listings were for these other states. And so it sort of came to me, one idea to contextualize the information about Oregon was to put it in comparison to Washington. And so today I'll be talking about that comparison, what I've learned from it, and what I think it means for us in terms of creating a more diverse Oregon.
Oh, perfect. I love it because even before we got started with the presentation, you were already given that like sneak behind the curtain, with the source. You had this idea in mind of what you were hoping to find, quickly realized that you weren't going to be able to do that, and kind of shifted gears to continue this research and contextualize this information for all of us. And, I think most of us are fans of the Pacific Northwest in general. So it is kind of nice to have that comparison of these two states that are neighbors and that were at one point, part of the same Oregon country. So yeah, that sounds awesome. I'm pretty sure, I know that I'm excited to learn more, and I'm pretty sure we all are. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to you to present.
Cool, awesome. Well, just want to say a warning at the start. I will be referencing the old time written statements about African Americans, so there will be numerous usage of the N word. I am excited that I'm able to talk about this topic because I've recently been interested in the differences between Oregon and Washington. That despite Oregon's geographical proximity to California, that it's Washington that has the larger African American population. And so I'm diving somewhat into this larger exploration about the differences between the domestic migration patterns of African Americans to the Northwest. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit about what I've uncovered and how I think it will help us create a more diverse Oregon. But before we can talk about the Green Book, we have to talk about the reason why the Green Book was needed. We'll get to sundown towns in a moment, but before we get to sundown towns, we have to understand what was in the white imagination at the time that created this desire for racial separatism from African Americans. Racist chromolithography permeated American life during the 19th and 20th century. These were images, objects, film, media that portrayed African Americans in a negative light, often in the form of stereotypes. These portrayals often categorized African Americans as dangerous and a problem to be avoided altogether. Noticeably, there was a difference in the portrayal of African Americans pre-Civil War versus post-Civil War. Pre-Civil War, African Americans were often portrayed as docile servants who needed to be controlled in order to exercise their existence in humanity. Post-Civil War, African Americans were more often portrayed as beast-style animals who needed the control of white Americans to protect American dignity. Both of these images reinforced the need for white control over African Americans. These images permeated American life. They're kind of like the modern day equivalent of memes. People would share them as postcards, and they'd be in newspaper clippings. They were really all over American life, and people back in the day had way less intake of information. We have the internet, TV, movies, but back in the day, they just had a few sources of information. And so most white people's contact with African Americans came in the form of these racist images. And so these racist images were then imposed on the faces of actual African Americans and contributed to the way that African Americans were treated in American society. I would recommend for any of you who are interested in learning more about racist chromolithography to look up the Jim Crow Museum. It is a museum in Michigan that has a virtual tour of the museum, and you can learn more about the differing kinds of racist imagery that permeated the United States. When I took a virtual tour of that museum, it really sort of ruined the idea of carnivals for me, because back in the day, things like a dunk tank were called Dunk-a-Nigger. When you would throw a baseball at a wooden face, that was often the face of a real African American. And American entertainment often came at the expense of violence against African Americans. And if it wasn't real African Americans, it was often the portrayal of them. Bowling pins were often depictions of African Americans. And so it really takes you aback that these images and this idea of African Americans was so embedded into American life that just playing board games, going bowling included racist depictions and violence against African Americans. And so it is not a surprise that because of this racist imagery, there was a negative perception of African Americans that created this desire for separatism from Black people. And so that brought us sundown towns. Sundown towns are a unique phenomenon in American history in that they were so widespread but so little documented. We know that there were dozens, if not hundreds, of signs across the United States that said some iteration of, "Nigger, don't let the sun come down on you here." Yet, we actually don't have a picture of one of those signs in American circulation. Sundown towns were more so a phenomenon of the North and West. Oddly enough, they were not much a factor in the traditional cotton-picking South. Whites in the traditional cotton-picking South had a different relationship to African Americans. Their opinion was, why would you exclude your maid, your janitor, your shoe shine? In this particular region of the country, African Americans were more seen as a group of people to be controlled, as opposed to a group of people to be completely avoided. And so this was more so a phenomenon of the North and West. And for those of us who are in this work of reconciling stories of historical injustice, this is really a local issue and is of great importance to us in the Northwest. A 1916 editorial from Beloit, Wisconsin lamented this problem that, quote, "The Negro problem has moved north. Rather, the Negro problem has sped from south to north. Within a few years, experts predict the Negro population of the North will be tripled. It's your problem, or it will be when the Negro moves next door. With the black tide setting north, the Southern Negro, formerly a docile tool, is demanding better pay, better food, and better treatment. It's a national problem now instead of a sectional problem, and it has got to be solved." Sundown towns were considered ordinary and matter of fact, and interestingly, there was really no shame associated with these racist signs like, "Nigger, don't let the sun come down on you here." In 1936, Germany hosted the Olympics in Berlin, and noticeably, Nazi Germany had the surrounding communities take down their anti-Jewish signs. Yet that is not something we did in the United States when we hosted the Olympics in 1932. Depending on what direction you were traveling to Los Angeles, you could see a "Nigger, don't let the sun come down on you" sign while you're traveling the California highway. And so this era of American life is something that I really think needs greater exploration. In particular, this era that is often referred to as the Great Nadir, between 1870 to 1930, when African Americans lost rights and their movement became more constrained. W.E.B. Du Bois remarked of this time that, quote, "The slave went free, stood for a brief moment in the sun, then moved back toward slavery." African Americans had more rights in 1870 than they did in 1950. African Americans were more widely dispersed as a people group in 1870 than they were in 1930, when African Americans were violently pushed from rural settings into condensed urban communities. Because, most often the case, sundown towns were not spaces in which white people went to and said, "No Black people." They were most often interracial spaces that the whites pushed out the African American population. These were, as they would call, racial cleansings that often spurred after African American accusations of attacks on a white person. This often meant pushing the other African Americans out of town and resulted in unknown loss of property and financial assets due to African Americans being forced to leave their communities. One such instance that I would like to highlight is in Anna, Illinois. Anna, spelled Anna, was colloquially referred to as "ain't no niggers allowed" until into the 21st century. In 1909, a white woman from nearby Cairo was murdered, and an African American man named William James was accused of her murder. You can see his picture on the screen. Within 72 hours of being arrested, William James was lynched in front of a mob of 10,000 people. You can see a picture of that mob up in the upper left-hand corner. The mob tried to hang him, but the rope snapped, and the mob riddled his body with bullets, set his body on fire, and cut off his head to be displayed on a hiking post. The newspaper wrote that, quote, "thousands dance with glee as body is burned." Any African American who was living in Anna, Illinois, was forced out of the community that day. Sheriff Frank Davis believed that William James was innocent. He's quoted as saying, "I questioned him a great deal while we were in the woods together, and he insisted all the time that he was innocent. I am very much in doubt whether he is the guilty man or not." Anna would stay a sundown town well into the 21st century, and nearby communities also went sundown, as sundown towns were often contagious as this violence spread across the region. So, what did sundown towns look like? Well, they may or may not have allowed African Americans during day. Some communities allowed African Americans to work during the day, but they had better be gone by night. It is an often misnomer that cities had ordinances that noted their community as a sundown town. In my research, I would say only a handful of communities across the country had any sort of city ordinance about being a sundown town. Most often, sundown towns were culturally and socially enforced, and most communities had some sort of sign about whites only, and they were particularly enforced via housing, where African Americans were frozen out from the housing market, which limited their employment in the community. And being, quote, Negro free was an advertising point for communities, just like good schools, good parks are today. These often came in the form of restrictive covenants. At the time, many banks wouldn't fund loans to houses that didn't have some form of restrictive covenant on the deed. Restrictive covenants read something often along the lines of, "No lot shall ever be sold, conveyed, leased, or rented to any person other than one of the white or Caucasian race, nor shall any lot ever be used or occupied by any person other than one of the white or Caucasian race, except such as may be serving as domestics for the owner or tenant of said lot while said owner or tenant is residing therein." Cumberland County, Tennessee advertised in the local newspaper that, quote, "no mosquitoes, no malaria, and no nigger." This was in the 1920s, and Cumberland County ran out their African American population during the 1900s. In Comanche County, Texas, the local representative advertised that Comanche County, long famous for many unique advantages, has gained national distinction for being the home of the purest Anglo-Saxon population of any county in the United States. Comanche County, Texas drove out their African American population in 1886. Mentone, Indiana advertised that, quote, "with a population of 1,100, Mentone has not a Catholic, foreigner, Negro, nor Jew living in the city." The enforcement of sundown culture was often done by the local law enforcement or the young white men of the time. However, there is one community in Indiana, Villa Grove, that would sound a siren at 6 p.m. every night that would signal that African Americans had better be out of town. This form of excluding African Americans and pushing them out from white communities was, in a way, Oh, it was a way for young men to come of age in their community. There's an article from 1905 from Syracuse, Ohio, that I think represents this history well. In Syracuse, Ohio, on the Ohio River, a town of about 2,000 inhabitants, no Negro is permitted to live, not even to stay overnight, under any consideration. This is an absolute rule in this year, 1905, and has existed for several generations. The enforcement of this unwritten law is in the hands of the boys from 8 to 20 years of age. When a Negro is seen in town during the day, he is generally told of these traditions, and he is warned to leave before sundown. If he fails to take heed, he is surrounded at about the time darkness begins and is addressed by the leader of the gang in about this language. No nigger is allowed to stay in this town overnight. Get out of here now and get out quick. He sees from 25 to 30 boys around him talking in subdued voices and waiting to see whether he obeys. If he hesitates, little stones begin to reach from unseen quarters and soon persuade him to begin his retreat. He is not allowed to walk, but is told to get on his little dog trot. The command is always effective, for it is backed by stones in the ready hands of boys none too friendly. So long as he keeps up a good gait, the crowd which follows just at his heels, and which keeps growing until it sometimes numbers 75 to 100 boys, is good-natured and contents itself with yelling, laughing, and hurling gibes at its victim. But let him stop his trot for one moment, for any cause whatsoever, and the stones immediately take effect as their chief persuader. Thus they follow him to the furthest limits of the town, where they send him on, while they return to the city with triumph, and tell their fathers all about the function, how fast the victim ran, how scared he was, how he pleaded and promised that he would go and never return if they would only leave him alone. Then the fathers tell how they used to do the same thing, and thus the heroes of two wars spend the rest of the evening by the old campfire, recanting their several campaigns. Just like lynchings, the enforcement of sundown culture was a rite of passage for many young white men in the community, and any whites who did not obey and follow these sundown ordinances were similarly dissuaded and pushed out of the community. Naturally, this had an effect on African Americans. Beyond just the physical danger, there was the emotional impact of dealing with racist incidences. For those of us who are African American, many of us can recount our own experiences with racism, usually in perfect detail, because these instances are seared into our mind. And so there's a poem that I would like to share. It's called Incident by Conti Colon. Once riding in old Baltimore, heart filled, held filled with glee, I saw a Baltimorean keep looking straight at me. Now I was 8 and very small, and he was no whit bigger. And so I smiled, but he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until December. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. You'll notice a little bit later when I read a portion from the Green Book that this word embarrassment keeps coming up. And that's something that, for other African Americans who are my age, this fear and danger and embarrassment that comes with traveling most parts of the United States is something that I've taken for granted in my life, and diving into the Green Book has certainly sort of taught me about the perils that existed for African Americans during most of our country's history. And so most African Americans just chose the path of least resistance. If a community was known as a sundown town, they would avoid it. They wouldn't try to integrate it. They would find places where that community was more amenable to their presence. And so in the Northwest, between Oregon and Washington, Washington was most often the place of least resistance because Oregon was founded with racially exclusionary laws that made it illegal to be Black in Oregon until 1926. This racist attitude extended beyond just our laws, but permeated our culture. In 1864, a Democratic legislator from Yamhill County named George Lawson proposed to his fellow legislators that an amendment to Oregon's constitution be, quote, that a Negro, Chinaman, or Indian has no right that a white man is bound to respect, and that a white man may murder, rob, rape, shoot, stab, and cut any of these worthless and vagabond races without being called to account. While this amendment was never taken to vote, this represented a constituency of Oregonians who felt that people of color had no rights that a white man was bound to respect in this white utopia of Oregon. It can be said with pretty good confidence that nearly all of Oregon, with the exception of Portland, was once a sundown town. And what distinguished sundown towns in the Northwest from that of the Northeast and the Midwest is that it most often was places where whites entered in first and then tried to prevent African Americans from entering, unlike that of the South. However, we did have communities go sundown in a similar fashion. In 1902, an African American man named Alonzo Tucker was lynched in Coos Bay, Oregon. And following that lynching, there was talks to run the other African Americans out of town. African Americans in 1870 made up, there were zero, there, but in 1870, 17 of Oregon's 32 counties had 0 to 10 African Americans living in them. But that number would grow to 28 of Oregon's 32 counties by 1930 as African Americans were pushed out from our rural communities into condensed urban settings. And Oregon was no stranger to racist chromolithography. Famously, we had a restaurant in Portland called the Coon Chicken Inn that you can see depicted on your screen. The entrance to the restaurant was that of a giant black Sambo figurine. It was a chicken restaurant, and the adage was that even a coon would like this fried chicken. Oregon's reputation permeated across the country. I came across a quote from a professor of African American studies at Boston University who recounted that during the 1960s, quote, Blacks were afraid to drive through Grants Pass or Medford. A Black friend of mine put a loaded pistol on the front seat of his car when he drove through those towns. Doing this work across Oregon, whenever I would tell an older African American that I was traveling to regions of Southern Oregon, without fail, they would always ask me two questions. How many people am I going with? And am I carrying? Because of this long-standing fear and precautions that African Americans had to take when traveling Oregon. And so this brings us to the Green Book, a guide for African Americans to find restaurants, barbershops, hotels that would serve them without this fear of embarrassment. Whether you were traveling by foot, car, or train, traveling across the United States was dangerous for African Americans. I'm going to read two introductions from the 1948 Green Book, as well as a letter from the editor from the 1954 edition. With the introduction of this travel guide in 1936, it has been our idea to give the Negro traveler information that will keep him from running into difficulties, embarrassments, and to make his trips more enjoyable. There will be a day sometime in the near future when this guide will not have to be published. That is when we as a race will have equal opportunities and privileges in the United States. It will be a great day for us to suspend this publication, for then we can go wherever we please and without embarrassment. But until that time comes, we shall continue to publish this information for your convenience each year. The white traveler for years has no difficulty in getting accommodations, but with the Negro, it has been different. He, before the advent of the Negro travel guides, has had to depend on word of mouth, and then accommodations weren't always available. But nowadays, things are different. He has his own travel guide that he can depend on for all the information that he wants and with a selection. Hence, these guides have made traveling more popular and without running into embarrassing situations. As I was reading through these introductions, what really stood out to me was that constant use of the word embarrassment. When I had sort of gone into this thinking about the Green Book, I had really just sort of thought about physical danger, not necessarily the psychological danger that comes with going into spaces that are hostile. And while you may leave that space without any physical marks to your body, your spirit often comes away bruised from these racist incidents. The Green Book was started by Victor Green in 1936. Victor Green was a postal worker, which is one of the reasons why the Green Book was so successful, because he and his fellow postal workers were able to recruit Black businesses along their postal route to be listed in the Green Book. Victor Green was also friends with a marketing exec at a company called Exxon, which is now ExxonMobil. And any gas station that served Exxon gas would display the Green Book for purchase for the traveler's convenience. The Green Book lasted for 30 years, but didn't publish for 4 years during World War II, as general production in the United States slowed during the war efforts. Western states appeared in the Green Book for the first time in 1939. There were other Black motorist guides during this time period, but most of them went out of business, and the Green Book is what lasted the longest. The Green Book provided African Americans an opportunity to use their dollar as power. There was a quote that was often used at the time that was either buy where you can work or don't buy where you can't work, as protests during the 1930s really took off when African Americans began to boycott establishments that didn't treat African Americans with dignity. The Green Book can be thought of in two iterations: the Green Book from 1936 to 1956, and from 1956 to 1967. In 1956, there was a change in the format of the Green Book where they stopped listing things like barbershops, restaurants, taverns, saloons, and they went to pretty much only listing hotels. And so, as the Green Book had started, it became a tool for community-based business dealings. But after 1956, it switched to being purely for the traveler. This coincided with the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954. One thing that for me is a little bit sad, reading in the Green Book, is sort of this optimism about the state of race in America at this time. And so in 1954, when seemingly restaurant and business segregation would be illegal, they switched to just doing hotels so that African Americans they felt that African Americans would be able to shop at any business they chose after Brown versus Board of Education. That wouldn't be the case, and so they would keep publishing. And following the 1967 Civil Rights Act, that's when the Green Book ended with sort of this optimism that African Americans would be able to freely travel the United States and go into businesses without fear of embarrassment. Unfortunately, I know many of us wish there was still a Green Book of sorts for our communities across the United States, and especially here in Oregon. And so how I did my research was I looked at 18 copies of the Green Book that were listed on the New York Public Library. I looked at issues 1939 to 1941. There was a gap during World War II. And then 1947 to 1962, with an exception for 1958, which for some reason was not listed at the New York Public Library. I would flip to the Oregon section, flip to the Washington section, and sort of painstakingly just take notes and write down the names of each business that was located in that edition. I would put those notes into an Excel sheet. And as you can see on your screen, there's a column for Oregon, column for Washington. And then also I would note which business left, be like subtract Barno's, it was a restaurant, add Atlas, it was a hotel. And so you can kind of see over time the difference in the number of listings for the Green Book in Oregon as compared to Washington. Those longer lines are for Washington, with the shorter line next to it being for Oregon. And this is sort of an image where you can sort of see green means there is an addition, red means there is subtraction. I was really excited in 1941 when sort of the Green Book exploded in Oregon, and there were all these restaurants. I was like, yes, Portland's food scene, we're getting coverage. And then sort of there was this sort of steady decline, and it was kind of sad to year after year go minus hotel, minus restaurant, minus barbershop. And then there weren't really any changes in Oregon between 1949 and 1955. I don't know if there was an error in their reporting or if simply there was sort of a stagnation in the growth and evolution of Black life in Oregon. And so Washington didn't experience their decline a little bit later until 1952. You see a bunch of red at the 1956 edition when they switched formats. And then there was about an even number of listings for hotels in a variety of cities across Oregon and Washington. One thing that I'll talk a little bit about at the end is my questions about how they changed their reporting format, because there were locations outside of Portland listed in 1957, but not previously. And so one thing that I'm curious about, and if I had more time to research, was how long were those businesses accommodating to African Americans? And what could be learned about sort of my original expedition for this topic about the safe havens for African Americans over the course of Oregon's history. Looking at the Green Book listings, you see that there are more Washington's listings. There were more African Americans in Washington than in Oregon. I looked at census data for 1940 to 1970 and then made a reference for 2020. Between 1940 to 1970, African Americans in Washington outnumbered African Americans in Oregon by about 3 times, with an exception for 1970, where, for a reason I'm unsure of, Washington's African American population shrank. But come the modern era, 2020, African Americans in Washington outnumbered those in Oregon by greater than 3 times. So I learned from this expedition that Washington had more listings than Oregon, which is kind of what I was expecting. It is a reflection of the growth of Black life that happened in Washington in a way that didn't quite happen in Oregon because of the racial hostility of the time that made creating social and economic hubs for African Americans difficult during the 19th century. There's a complex reason why there's this difference, and then there's a simple reason. The complex reason has to do with a variety of economic factors. Washington's economy was more diverse by industry, which thereby created a greater pool of jobs available to African Americans. And so Washington had a more diverse workforce, and particularly railroad and maritime opportunities provided African Americans a greater sense of workforce stability in Washington. In Oregon, despite the sort of similar low-paying jobs. And there was more economic mobility in Washington. Going through the Green Book listings, I saw that there was a beauty parlor in Washington that started as a beauty parlor, but then opened a beautician school. There were a number of restaurants that started in one part of the state but moved to Seattle. There was mobility to be able to move industries. There was a greater variety of industries available in the Washington Green Book. Professions such as lawyer and doctor, pharmacist in particular, were available to African Americans in Washington, though confined to just servicing the African American community. And so, because of these variety of industries, Washington was more attractive to African Americans during the Great Migration. So that's the complex economic reasons, but really the The simple reason is that one state was founded with racially exclusionary laws while the other was not. Oregon's Black exclusionary laws created a climate that was difficult for African Americans to integrate into and create these hubs during the 19th century. Higher education institutions like the University of Washington was more involved in activism during this time period, which supported the growth of more civil rights organizations in the Seattle area than in Portland. And so looking at the growth of listings in the Green Book compared to the growth of African Americans in Oregon and Washington, my takeaway was that it's sort of what came first, the chicken or the egg. With more Black people comes more Black community fixtures, but with more Black community fixtures comes more Black people. And so I hope that we can become intentional about installing more Black community fixtures so that we can create more diverse communities. But some of my specific takeaways from the Green Book was the power of single individuals. Throughout the Green Book, there were listings for these things called tourist homes. These were individuals who made their homes available for African Americans to stay in. And in particular, there were two names that showed up throughout most of the editions of the Green Book in Washington. In Everett, Washington, there was a Mrs. J.T. Payne who was listed between 1939 to 1959. And in Tacoma, a Mrs. A. Robinson was listed between 1939 to 1953. I tried to find more information about these women to try and learn about these stalwarts of African American culture in their community, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any information beyond their listings in the Green Book. These women at times were the only listings for the Green Book in their community. And so it really stood out to me the power of a single individual to make a difference in their community. These women opened up their homes and were able to create some semblance of Black life outside of the urban core of Seattle. And I would love for these women to be remembered more in history as pioneers for African Americans in the Northwest. Another thing that stuck out to me was the continued legacy of the Black barbershop and the Black beauty parlor that we see today. I had kind of wondered growing up, why was the Black barbershop a place of particular significance in the Black community? Looking at the Green Book, it's because these were one of the few businesses that African Americans were able to open up. These were gathering places, not just to meet a need, but to connect with your community. And so this gave me a greater appreciation for the barbershop that I go to, because I see these particular community fixtures as so important to African American history. It's important to note that the listings in the Green Book were not a perfect indication of Black businesses throughout the country and in Oregon and Washington. Noticeably, in 1941, a Dixie Chicken Inn was listed in Seattle. But I looked at the address that was listed and compared that to where the Coon Chicken Inn was in Seattle, and it was about the same area. I am unsure why this restaurant was listed in the Green Book in 1941. I would love to check. There was no 1942 version, and during the middle of the 1940s when the Coon Chicken Inn closed. So I'm not sure why that was particularly listed. And then I know from firsthand experience, there is a motel in Grants Pass that I go to when I stay in the area that had a history of allowing African Americans a place to stay, as it was just outside of the city limits. It's called the Motel Del Rogue, and it's not listed in the Green Book, despite its history of being a safe haven for African Americans. And looking at the format change, this is an early indication of a softening of sundown town culture in the Northwest, that 1956 time period. One thing that if I had more time, I would look into the specifics of these communities. to see how this softening of sundown town culture affected their African American populations, and whether the surrounding communities still presented a hostile threat to African Americans. My biggest takeaway from looking at the Green Book was this idea that there is a correlation between the number of listings and the presence of Black life and the number of Black people. And that, there really goes back to this sort of simple explanation for the difference between Oregon and Washington is that the difference in trajectory between our two states were really rooted in the fact that Oregon was a Black exclusionary law and Washington was not. And I think that what this means for us in 2024 is that an intentionality towards creating more diverse communities is possible through the addition of Black community fixtures and institutional commitments to diversity. At least one known person was actually expelled from Oregon under the state's Black exclusionary laws. His name was Jacob Vanderpool, and this was in Oregon City. He was a business owner and was forced to leave Oregon after a competing white business owner conspired to have him arrested. Shortly thereafter, Jacob Vanderpool was arrested and expelled from the state of Oregon, never to return. Myself and the Oregon Black Pioneers are hoping to place a historical marker where Jacob Vanderpool's business once stood. But I also want to create in Oregon City, knowing that the experience of Jacob Vanderpool is still being experienced by people of color today. I want to create an African American specific community center in Oregon City called the Vanderpool House, a gathering space for African Americans in the community. I made a friend at a conference a few months ago. He's from Boston and he's Asian, and he told me about how he describes his neighborhood. He describes his neighborhood in two terms: pre-Asian grocery market and post-Asian grocery market. Because when the Asian grocery market was installed in his community, it caused a significant increase in the Asian population of his community. Because people were able to see that there was a community fixture that met their need and that was a place that was welcoming to them. And I hope that we can create that same phenomenon in Oregon City with the Vanderpool House, that we can meet the needs of African Americans to connect with one another, but we can also signal that we can hopefully grow the African American population of Oregon City, as much of Clackamas County has a lot to offer. But, thinking about changing racial demographics, I was reminded these last few weeks that white America is not ready for changing racial demographics in the United States. We just have to look at the conversation that has surrounded Springfield, Ohio, and Trump and Vance and the whole. They're eating the dogs because of an influx of Haitian immigrants to the Springfield area. I don't think that we in the United States are prepared for the reality of changing demographics in the United States. It's expected that by the year 2044, people of color will make up greater than 50% of the US population. But I don't think the United States is going to, quote, brown evenly, with certain pockets of the country becoming more diverse while others do not. And so my hypothesis is that, similar to Springfield, Ohio, there will be a second generation of white flight where whites leave the suburb. Similar to how the whites left the cities to move to the suburbs. Whites will leave the more demographically diverse parts of the country and move to the Northwest and Northeast. And with all that happening around the 2050s, Oregon was founded in 1859, and my hope is that 200 years don't go by and Oregon is once again the white utopia that people move to specifically for its whiteness. And so my hope through the Oregon Remembrance Project is to ultimately try and prevent that from happening, to write a new ending to the story of the state found with racially exclusionary laws. Over these next 3 decades, we're going to be busy with what we're calling the 2050 vision. This idea to raise the African American population of Oregon from 2 to 5% by the year 2050. that may sound ambitious, but with the changes in racial demographics across the United States, uh, African Americans will be moving all across the country. And I hope that we can, by installing more Black community fixtures, we can create larger African American communities here in Oregon and increase the African American population of our state. Thinking about doing something as large as changing the racial demographics of the state, I'm reminded of Mrs. J.T. Payne and Mrs. A. Robinson, that these single individuals were able to make an impact in their community's history, that these two individuals were able to create an oasis for Black life in their state. And so I hope that each of us can sort of continue that story, continue that legacy, and that we can grow the African American culture in Oregon, which I think is special. And that because of this unique history, we are uniquely posed to be this safe haven for African Americans. And I hope that you will join me in the creation and the growth of Black life in Oregon. And so to conclude our time, I just want to thank you all and leave you with a quote. Change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Taylor, for taking the time to do that research and to really walk us through a lot of this, this history, this really real history that has existed here and across the US, and helping to contextualize it against Washington and here in Oregon. I think the background of all the work that you're doing really helps so that you're able to share this story in a way that is both really informative and harrowing, but also like inspiring. I feel like you have a superpower in somehow turning, these really dark moments and shining a light on them and helping to uplift communities to change the narrative. So, thank you for kind of giving us a glimpse not only into the historical research, but also the background of doing the work that you're doing here in Oregon. We've got some folks in the audience saying bravo, thank you, and I cannot, repeat their thoughts enough. So just thank you so much for your time. I do have some questions, a couple questions that I wanted to ask and some questions that came in through the chat. So I'll go ahead and kind of dive into that. I was curious, you did mention that there were some, things left out or strangely added that didn't necessarily make sense. And I was kind of curious, in your research, did you see any insight as to why people and places here in Oregon were left out? For example, you mentioned the women in Washington that had opened up their homes to folks, and there's a very long storied history of that happening here in Oregon, and especially like in Eugene, for example, with the Mims family, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and some of our audience might be familiar with too, wherein folks were offering up their homes to, I guess maybe the Mims were more offering up their homes to like famous folks and not, I don't know if they were offering up their homes to people like in the Green Book. But my question is, did you see anything about why folks like them would have been left out? And also, before you answer that, I thought perhaps maybe it had something to do with the postal workers. Like maybe there wasn't like local Black postal workers that could help kind of, dig up the information here. I'm just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I wish I knew more about
Sure.
why there sort of was that stagnation for Oregon over the course of a number of years. I don't think that necessarily is a representation of of any sort of stagnation in Black life in Oregon. It seemed that we were really just sort of focused on Portland. Pre-1956, all of the listings for Oregon were in Portland, except for the very first one in 1939. There was a hotel in Pendleton that was listed. It's actually alphabetically, it's the first listing for the Green Book in Oregon. And so that's one of those other things that if I had more time, I would be super interested in learning about this particular, it's called the Flo Hotel, FLO is in Pendleton. And so, there weren't any tourist homes listed throughout the history of the Green Book for Oregon. I'm not sure why. If I had more time, I would learn more about their methodology for the inclusion of certain things. And I'm not sure about whether anything had to do with the postal service here in Oregon that limited the inclusion. But again, you get to the 1957 edition, and there are eight total communities listed in Oregon. And so, whether they were accumulating the information pre-format change is unknown to me. But there certainly was a change in the representation for Oregon outside of Portland in the latter iteration of the Green Book.
Sure. That definitely makes sense. I'm wondering, just like thinking out loud, perhaps there weren't as many Black community, like Black owned businesses throughout the state when they were more focused on, showcasing those businesses in the Green Book. But perhaps there were white owned businesses that were open to Black folks that would later be added when that was how the focus changed. So that's just something I'm thinking off the top of my head. But I want to definitely get to some of the audience questions. So we're curious, how might the experiences have differed between Black residents of sundown towns and Black travelers just passing through?
Mm-hmm.
Have you
interacted
with that in your work?
Yeah. So I sort of have two answers. One is that sometimes there were exceptions for sundown towns. There even was, I'm blanking, it might have been George Washington. I think it was George Washington Maddox, was an African-American man in Medford who was allowed to live in Medford despite the community's status of being a sundown town. And so for the sort of exceptions to sundown town culture, it was, they weren't seen as sort of equal participants in the community. They were sort of often nicknamed things like Nigger Liz, old like Uncle Tom, things that were really demeaning. And for instance, the George Washington Maddox, he was, we would refer to now as a little person, and that sort of changed his view of being a threat in the community. And so the people who were listed, people who were sort of the exceptions, were more like pets to the community than people. And so there, for George Washington Maddox, his death was listed in the newspaper. People attended his funeral. But it was more so in the way that you mourn the loss of a pet than you mourn the loss of a person. And so in terms of communities that were very hardline sundown, those exceptions were made sort of for people who existed, maybe a former slave who sort of then inhabited sort of a pet sort of existence in the community. And then, there really wasn't too much difference between the traveler and the resident because African Americans were just generally not able to live in these sundown communities. And if they were to live in the community, they sort of had to agree to exist in sort of a subservient role, which then sort of reinforced the white population's view of African Americans and sort of misrepresented sort of a confirmation bias. Well, you're like, oh, well, they agreed to be in the subservient role, therefore African Americans as a people are more agreeable to this state of being. And so at least most of my sundown town research has to do with Oregon. And besides George Washington Maddox, I haven't come across any exceptions. One of the sort of early African Americans who inhabited a sundown town was named Patricia Norman. She was an actress at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in Ashland. And when she was in the theater for that season, she had to stay at the local college because no one would rent to her within the actual community. And she needed security to and from the theater. And so, there really wasn't that much difference between the traveler and resident because residents weren't really allowed sort of in the first place.
Right. I mean, that does make sense. But the fact that there are exceptions, that's something interesting to keep in mind. And the fact that they were basically tokenized and treated as pets does make sense. How does that exception happen? That would be how. We also got a question. Do you think that the number of listings differs more from differences in the size of the Black community, or more from differences in how Black people were treated in these states, like between Washington and Oregon? Or maybe a
Um,
combination?
yeah, I would say that the number of listings had to do that was sort of a reflection of the growth of Black life.
Mm,
So you would see in Washington, potentially I can make available through the Oregon Black Pioneers some way. I have the Excel sheet that has the listings. It's kind of interesting.
yeah.
And so you see a variety of different businesses that weren't in Oregon. There's even a letter shop.
Oh, wow.
Very the most niche business of its kind. And so I think that just sort of like a small city versus a large city, the more people sort of created more listings. And one thing that I'd be curious about is uh, between 1941 and 1947, what happened that the Oregon listings started to decrease while the Washington listings continued to increase.
Interesting.
Unfortunately, I can only look at 1940 and 1950 census data.
Right.
I don't know if they did anything in between, and I wouldn't know how to access that. And so I don't really know what happened, sort of in terms of the increase of the population.
Sure.
But one thing that I would be, with further research would look into is sort of post World War II. What happened with what were the attitudes towards African Americans once the sort of particular need for increased employment happened?
Mm,
I would be curious, if I could go back in a time machine and then avoid the racism, I would be very curious to go back to 1940s Portland,
mm,
and to see what Black life was like there, and whether you could sort of, whether anything about it. So one of my answers would be, in terms of whether it was the way they were treated. It's kind of like if you were to plant seeds in two different kinds of soil,
mm,
and they were both to be watered differently.
mm.
Did that water, that sort of outside exterior forces, did that influence the growth and the decrease that happened between 1941 and 1947? That I'm unsure.
Sure. Great. Thank you so much for your insight. We better start wrapping it up, but I'm sure that you have so many more thoughts, and it's awesome hearing them. But before we go, the last question that we always make sure to ask is, how has what you uncovered changed our understanding of history? So locally, however you want to frame it.
Yeah, I have two answers. I'd sort of been wrestling with that question today. And I think for me personally, one thing is just uh, realizing how much about my experience in the United States, I take for granted. I was
Mm,
born in 1995, and sort of how my experience differs from many of the generations before me.
mm,
And it really makes me want to. So through the Oregon Remembrance Project, we do some oral history collection. And it really makes me, sort of have this reignited fire to want to collect oral history from our Black elders in our community, who can give sort of firsthand personal anecdotes about life in Oregon, that we may not be able to think of just sort of combing historical data. And so for me, that has sort of reignited a passion for collecting the stories, from those who are older than me. And then in terms of how I think this history, how it shapes our understanding, I think that uh, so it's sort of, if we wanted more Black community fixtures to exist in Oregon, we could kind of just sit around and wait for 100 years, and sort of inevitably we will get more Black people. But I would love to see more Black people in Oregon. And so I think for me, it is, if we can specifically invest in the creation of those things, of these fixtures that can be what I've called community anchors and community magnets, things that tether you or draw you into a space.
Oh,
That hopefully we can
sorry.
accelerate. Hopefully, we can accelerate the growth of African Americans in Oregon, so that we can add to the legacy that the Oregon Black pioneers and other historians have been preserved. And it just, fills me with joy to be a part of that history and that legacy.
Oh, well, thank you. That's a great way to kind of cap this conversation, and we are also thankful for the work that you're doing and for the time that you took out of your night to share this all with us. Thank you so much, Taylor. It has truly been a pleasure having you as our history investigator. All right, now that will do it for this episode, for our ninth episode of Black History Quest. Before I let everyone go, I just want to remind you that we do depend on the support of ordinary people who believe in sharing the stories of Oregon's Black history. So if you enjoyed this show and would like to support it and others like it, please consider a donation to Oregon Black Pioneers. And you can do so through our website and all the other good stuff. If you have questions about this particular episode or would like to become a history investigator yourself, please send an email to hello@OregonBlackPioneers.org. And as always, stay tuned for the next episode of Black History Quest, which will be in November, where we'll try to answer the question, how can one source change history? Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a great night.